Power is not destiny. Truth is not born inside us. What we call certainty is often only inheritance wearing the mask of wisdom. Before monarchs were questioned, before revolutions found their language, one mind dared to strip knowledge down to its naked origin. John Locke did not begin with God, nor with throne, nor with tradition. He began with a wound in human arrogance. What do we truly know, and by what right do we claim to know it? In an age still kneeling before divine authority, he confronted the idea of innate truth and found it hollow. The mind, he declared, is not born crowned with ideas. It is a blank surface, waiting, vulnerable, exposed. From that radical claim, he did more than reshape epistemology. He unsettled political power. He redefined freedom. He demanded that authority justify itself before reason. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. And yet, do not mistake softness for weakness. Locke's thought is a blade. If the mind begins empty, then no ruler governs by divine imprint. If knowledge grows from experience, then freedom must grow from consent. In a world that still struggles, even in 2025, to justify power and defend dignity, his questions remain unfinished. So we begin where he began, not with answers, but with the courage to confront the limits of what we think we know. Man is not born carrying truth inside him. Before entire civilizations built their authority upon sacred doctrines and inherited dogmas, before kings claimed divine right and churches declared eternal certainties, John Locke stood alone and stripped the illusion bare. He asked a question so simple it felt dangerous. What do we actually know? And how do we come to know it? In an age that assumed truth was stamped into the soul at birth, he dared to suggest that the human mind arrives empty, not ignorant, not defective, but unwritten. This was not a minor correction. It was an intellectual detonation. Locke rejected the doctrine of innate ideas with surgical clarity. He confronted the belief that moral principles, logical axioms, or the concept of God were implanted in us from the beginning. If such truths were truly inborn, he argued, they would be universally recognized. Yet children do not articulate metaphysics. Entire cultures disagree on morality. Even the most basic principles require learning. What kind of innate truth needs to be taught? He reviews something unsettling. What we call obvious is often merely familiar. The mind, he insisted, is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, not empty in capacity, but empty in content. There are no preloaded certainties, no secret inscriptions carved into the soul. The human being enters existence without ready-made knowledge. Everything that fills the mind must arrive through experience. This claim was radical because it displaced authority. If ideas are not innate, then no institution can claim access to truths that transcend human inquiry. Knowledge must be earned, not inherited. And if knowledge is earned, then power built upon unquestioned dogma begins to tremble. Locke grounded all knowledge in experience, but experience for him was not a vague appeal to living. He divided it into two precise sources: sensation and reflection. Sensation is the direct contact between the external world and our senses: colors, sounds, textures, movement. Reflection is the mind observing its own operations. Thinking, doubting, believing, willing. One gives us the raw material, the other allows us to examine and rearrange it. Every complex idea, no matter how abstract, can be traced back to these two roots. This is the first branch of his argument. All ideas originate from experience. Nothing enters the mind except through the door of sensation or the inner mirror of reflection. The belief that we are born knowing is not only false, it is intellectually lazy. It refuses to investigate the origins of thought. But Locke goes further. The second branch reveals the structure of understanding itself. The mind does not passively store impressions. It combines, compares, abstracts. From simple ideas, it constructs complex ones. From repeated experiences, it forms general concepts. There is no mystical leap from ignorance to knowledge. There is only gradual construction. Knowledge is architecture built from lived contact with reality. Many misunderstand this as reducing the human being to a mechanical recorder of stimuli. That is not Locke's position. The mind is active. It arranges, judges, synthesizes. But it cannot create content out of nothing. Even imagination is rearranged experience. The so-called originality of thought is recombination, not spontaneous revelation. The conclusion is unavoidable. If you wish to know, you must engage with the world. Withdrawal into dogma is not depth. It is stagnation. The third branch cuts even deeper. If there are no innate ideas, then there are no innate hierarchies of understanding. No class of humans born closer to truth. No divine mandate granting epistemic superiority. The child of a peasant and the heir to a throne begin equally blank. Experience, education, environment shape them, not metaphysical privilege. This was more than epistemology. It was the seed of political upheaval. When traditional authority claims legitimacy from eternal truth embedded in the soul, Locke's empiricism dismantles the foundation. If knowledge arises from experience, then institutions must justify themselves in lived reality. They cannot hide behind invisible certainties. The Church cannot declare unquestionable doctrine simply because it feels ancient. The monarchy cannot claim natural supremacy because it assumes divine inscription. Once the mind is blank at birth, inherited power becomes suspect. And yet Locke's position demands humility as well as courage. If all knowledge comes from experience, then our certainty is always limited by the scope of that experience. We do not possess absolute comprehension. We construct approximations. We revise them. We test them against further contact with reality. This is not weakness. It is intellectual integrity. Now confront the present. In an age saturated with information, we pretend to know more than ever. Data floods our senses. Opinions circulate at the speed of impulse. Yet the fundamental condition Locke described has not changed. We still begin blank. We still depend on experience. The difference is that much of our experience is mediated, curated, filtered. We mistake exposure for understanding. Modernity did not eliminate ignorance. It refined it. Today, people cling to ideological identities as if they were innate. Political allegiance feels natural. Moral outrage feels self-evident. But ask yourself, were these convictions present at birth, or were they assembled from accumulated impressions, repeated narratives, emotional reinforcements? If all ideas arise from experience, then your deepest beliefs are not sacred inheritances. They are constructed patterns. Are you willing to examine the construction? Locke forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about ourselves. We are more malleable than we wish to admit. Our convictions are not divine signatures. They are products of contact, memory, interpretation. This realization can feel destabilizing. If nothing is innate, what anchors us? If our mind was once empty, what guarantees that what now fills it is true? Here the psychological depth emerges. The human being longs for certainty because certainty promises security. An innate idea would be unshakable. It would grant identity without effort. But Locke strips that comfort away. He demands that we build ourselves through engagement. There is no hidden script guiding us from within. There is only exposure, reflection, construction. Freedom begins here, but so does responsibility. If your mind was not born with truth, then you cannot blame fate for your ignorance. If your ideas were shaped by experience, then you must choose your experiences carefully. You must interrogate them. You must reflect on them. Passive consumption becomes a form of self-betrayal. The blank slate is not innocence. It is potential. Consider the child, not as a romantic symbol of purity, but as a living demonstration of Locke's thesis. The child does not possess moral doctrines or logical systems. Through sensation, the world imprints itself. Through reflection, the child begins to recognize patterns. Gradually, the self emerges as a structured network of ideas. There is no pre-written destiny in the mind. There is development. This is why education becomes decisive. If the mind begins empty, then what enters it matters profoundly. Habit, environment, language, discipline, these do not decorate an already formed identity. They construct it. The difference between cruelty and compassion may lie not in innate moral coding, but in the quality of experiences encountered early and often. Does this unsettle you? It should, because it means the self is not a fixed essence, but a dynamic formation. You are not uncovering a hidden core that was always complete. You are continuously assembling a structure from impressions and reflections. Your identity is a narrative woven from experience. And narratives can deceive. Locke's insight also exposes the fragility of prejudice. If no idea is innate, then hatred is learned. Superiority is learned. Fear of the other is learned. They do not erupt from an inborn metaphysical law. They are constructed from repeated messages, reinforced associations, unexamined assumptions. Strip away the experiences that feed them, and they weaken. Yet the same mechanism that allows prejudice to form also allows wisdom to form. Experience is neutral. It offers raw material. Reflection determines what we do with it. Two individuals may encounter similar events, yet interpret them differently. The mind combines and abstracts according to its habits. Therefore, intellectual growth requires more than exposure. It requires disciplined reflection. Without reflection, sensation becomes noise. Locke's empiricism is often reduced to a theory of knowledge. That is too shallow. It is a theory of human formation. It confronts us with the fact that we are shaped by what we encounter and how we process it. There is no escape into innate certainty. There is only the ongoing labor of understanding. In a world that still seeks unquestionable foundations, this is both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it levels the field. No one is born with privileged access to truth. Terrifying because it removes the excuse of destiny. If your mind was blank, then what fills it is partly your responsibility. You cannot hide behind the claim that you were simply born this way in your thinking. Your ideas are products of engagement, and engagement can be altered. This insight quietly undermines authoritarianism. It demands pluralism. If knowledge comes from experience, and experiences differ, then perspectives will differ. No single viewpoint can claim absolute completeness. Dialogue becomes not a luxury, but a necessity. Intellectual humility becomes strength. Yet humility does not mean relativism. Locke did not argue that all ideas are equal. Some are clearer, more coherent, more consistent with accumulated experience. The test of truth lies in examination, comparison, evidence, not in ancestral authority. Strip away innate ideas, and you also strip away inherited illusions of infallibility. So where does this leave the human being? Standing, exposed, responsible, unfinished. The blank slate is not an emptiness to fear. It is the condition of freedom. But freedom without guidance can drift into chaos. If experience shapes us, then the structure of society, the nature of education, the quality of discourse become existential questions. They are not administrative details. They are the architecture of minds. And once you recognize that your thoughts were built rather than bestowed, a deeper question begins to press against you. If everything you know was constructed from experience, how do you ensure that the next layer you build is not another illusion waiting to be dismantled? Knowledge is not infinite, and the mind that refuses to admit this becomes dangerous. If everything we know is constructed from experience, then everything we know is also limited by experience. This is the blade that follows the blank slate. Once John Locke dismantled innate ideas, he did not replace them with arrogance. He replaced them with boundaries. Before the modern world declared certainty in science, ideology, or progress, he already understood a harder truth. Human understanding has edges, and those edges matter. There are degrees of knowledge. Not all claims stand on equal ground. Locke distinguished between intuitive certainty, demonstrative reasoning, and probable judgment. This was not academic categorization. It was a discipline of the mind. Intuitive knowledge is immediate. The mind perceives the agreement or disagreement between ideas directly. That white is not black. That a whole is greater than its part. No mediation, no chain of proof. The clarity is self-evident. This is the strongest form of human certainty. Demonstrative knowledge follows next. Here the mind moves step by step, linking ideas through reasoning. Mathematics stands as the model. The conclusion is not instantly seen, but gradually constructed. Each step must hold. Certainty exists, but it demands labor. It requires attention. Then comes probable knowledge. This is where most of life unfolds. We judge based on evidence, testimony, repeated experience. We do not possess absolute proof. We weigh likelihood. We estimate. We act without total assurance. This is not a defect of the human condition. It is its structure. The first branch of Locke's argument in this terrain is precise. Some knowledge is certain, but it is limited in scope. We can be absolutely sure of relations between clear ideas. We can be certain in mathematics. We can be certain that we exist while we think. But when we move beyond these narrow zones, certainty thins. Many misunderstand this and assume that if certainty is rare, then truth dissolves. That is the mistake. Locke does not erase truth. He scales it. He measures it. He demands proportional belief. The second branch cuts against intellectual arrogance. Not every question can be answered with absolute clarity. There are domains where probability is the highest form of understanding available to us. Questions about the future, questions about the hidden structures of nature, questions about the intentions of other minds. To demand certainty where only probability is possible is to distort reason. And yet, the modern mind often does exactly this. In an age that worships data, we crave definitive answers. We want science to eliminate doubt entirely. We want political theories to guarantee justice. We want moral systems that leave no ambiguity. But the structure of human cognition does not allow such perfection. Our ideas are drawn from finite experience. Our reasoning is sequential. Our evidence incomplete. Why then do we pretend to be omniscient? The third branch of Locke's insight is ethical. Intellectual humility is not weakness. It is a moral stance. To recognize the limits of one's knowledge is to refuse tyranny of thought. Dogmatism thrives where limits are denied. Extremism grows where uncertainty is seen as betrayal. When a person confuses probability with certainty, they become rigid. They defend opinions as if they were mathematical truths. They refuse dialogue. They silence dissent. They turn belief into weapon. Locke saw this long before ideological polarization became a defining feature of public life. He understood that freedom of thought requires acknowledgement of cognitive limitation. If I know that my grasp of truth is partial, I leave room for yours. If I recognize that my conclusions are built on probable evidence, I remain open to revision. Humility protects liberty. But humility does not mean paralysis. Locke never argued that because certainty is rare, we should suspend judgment entirely. Life demands action. Governments must legislate. Individuals must decide. The key is proportional assent. Believe according to evidence. Do not elevate probability to dogma. Do not reduce strong evidence to mere opinion. This balance is fragile. It demands discipline. Now turn inward. Why is it so difficult for the human being to accept limits? Because limits threaten identity. We attach ourselves to beliefs as extensions of the self. To question a conviction feels like self-erosion. If my worldview is uncertain, who am I? If my moral framework is probabilistic, what anchors me? Here, the existential tension emerges. The mind desires closure. It seeks finality. Ambiguity generates anxiety. Yet, the structure of knowledge ensures that ambiguity will remain. Locke forces us to inhabit this discomfort. He demands that we confront the fact that we operate within boundaries we did not choose. This is not merely epistemology. It is a psychological trial. Consider how often conflict arises not from evidence, but from overconfidence. Two individuals, each armed with partial information, speak as if they possess total clarity. They do not argue about degrees of probability. They assert absolute truth. The conversation collapses. Violence, whether verbal or physical, begins with exaggerated certainty. What if the real danger is not ignorance, but the illusion of complete knowledge? Locke's framework exposes the arrogance hidden in many intellectual movements, the claim to final answers, the promise of total systems, the assurance that history has reached its culmination. These are temptations. They offer comfort. They relieve the anxiety of uncertainty, but they exceed the legitimate reach of human understanding. In the 2025 landscape of artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and algorithmic governance, this warning intensifies. We trust models. We rely on predictive systems. We quantify behavior. Yet behind every model lies assumption. Behind every dataset lies selection. Behind every conclusion lies interpretation. Technology does not abolish epistemic limits. It amplifies their consequences. If we forget that our knowledge is layered and graded, we risk surrendering judgment to systems we barely comprehend. We risk mistaking statistical probability for moral certainty. We risk constructing policies as if our projections were infallible. Locke would demand restraint. But restraint is not passivity. It is disciplined awareness. It is the recognition that certainty is precious and rare, that most of our beliefs operate within probability, that disagreement does not necessarily signal malice, but difference in evidence. This insight also transforms personal life. You do not fully know yourself. You possess intuitive awareness of certain internal states. You can reason demonstratively about aspects of your character, but much of your self-understanding remains probabilistic. You infer motives. You interpret memories. You revise narratives. Yet, how often do you treat your self-assessment as unquestionable? How often do you declare that you are simply this way, as if the verdict were mathematically proven. To admit limits is to reopen possibility. Locke's graded knowledge structure invites continuous revision, not chaotic doubt, not nihilistic skepticism, but calibrated belief, strong where evidence is strong, tentative where evidence is thin, silent where evidence is absent. This intellectual posture becomes the foundation of freedom of thought. Without it, discourse collapses into authoritarian assertion. With it, society can sustain disagreement without destruction. But the demand is severe. It requires you to endure uncertainty without fleeing into dogma. It requires you to hold conviction without absolutism. It requires you to act decisively while knowing that error remains possible. Can you live like that? Most cannot. The temptation to convert probability into certainty is overwhelming. It simplifies the world. It reduces cognitive strain. It offers psychological security. But it also breeds fanaticism. Locke's realism about limits prevents this descent. He reminds us that the scope of human understanding is finite, that some questions exceed our cognitive reach, that humility is not surrender, but wisdom. And once you accept that knowledge has boundaries, a new question arises. If our certainty is limited, if our evidence is partial, if our reasoning is constrained, then what can we say about human authority itself? On what ground does one person claim the right to rule another with confidence? If even our knowledge is bounded, how can power pretend to be absolute? The recognition of epistemic limits does not end in skepticism. It prepares the ground for examining the conditions under which human beings can live together without tyranny. It shifts the focus from abstract certainty to practical coexistence. It forces us to ask not what ultimate truths justify domination, but what shared conditions allow freedom. And from that question, the inquiry moves from the boundaries of knowledge to the boundaries of power, from the architecture of the mind to the architecture of society, where the status of human beings before any government must be faced without illusion. If our knowledge has limits, then no man is born with the right to rule another. This is the next rupture. Once certainty is restrained and arrogance dismantled, power itself must stand trial. If no one possesses absolute knowledge, if all understanding is bounded and graded, then the claim that some are naturally destined to govern collapses under its own weight. Before modern democracies declared equality as a political slogan, John Locke had already grounded it in the structure of human existence. He begins with a simple but devastating assertion. In their original condition, human beings are free and equal, not identical in strength, not uniform in talent, but equal in moral status, equal in ownership of themselves, equal in their standing before the law of nature. This state is not chaos. It is not a battlefield of unchecked violence. It is a condition prior to political institutions where no common superior exists on earth. Each person possesses the same natural liberty. Each person answers not to a king, but to reason. Locke's first claim here is foundational. Freedom is not granted by government. It precedes government. Equality is not bestowed by law. It exists before law is written. The human being does not receive liberty as a favor from authority. Liberty is the original condition. This strikes at the heart of inherited hierarchy. In an age when monarchs defended their power as divinely ordained, when social ranks were treated as reflections of cosmic order, Locke cut through the illusion. No one is born stamped with a natural right to command. No bloodline carries metaphysical authority. The state of nature does not recognize crowns. What then governs human behavior in this original condition? Reason. Locke insists that even without political structures, there is law. Not statutory law, not decrees issued by rulers, but natural law. Reason teaches that because we are equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in life, health, liberty, or possessions. The preservation of oneself and of mankind becomes the guiding principle. This is not sentimental optimism. It is moral architecture. The second branch of his argument clarifies a common misunderstanding. The state of nature is not a utopia. It contains freedom, but also vulnerability. Because each individual has the right to enforce natural law, conflicts arise. Bias intrudes. Passion distorts judgment. Without an established authority to adjudicate disputes, insecurity grows. Freedom exists, but it is unstable. This instability does not erase equality. It reveals the tension within it. If all are equal judges in their own case, then partiality becomes inevitable. The right to punish wrongdoing belongs to everyone, yet this very universality produces disorder. Locke does not romanticize the pre-political condition. He analyzes it. The third branch deepens the foundation. In this original state, human beings possess natural rights. The right to life, the right to liberty, the right to property. These are not privileges negotiated into existence. They are not cultural inventions. They arise from the fact that each person owns himself. Self-ownership is the core. To say that you own yourself is to say that no other person has inherent authority over your body or will. Your life is not a resource for another's ambition. Your freedom is not an instrument of another's plan. Your labor is not automatically the property of a superior. This idea still detonates. If each individual owns himself, then slavery is a violation of natural law. Tyranny is an assault on equality. Arbitrary rule becomes illegitimate, no matter how ancient its lineage. The state of nature does not endorse submission. It establishes autonomy. Yet autonomy alone does not guarantee security. Now confront the modern condition. In 2025, we speak constantly of rights. We frame debates in the language of entitlement and protection. But how often do we remember that rights, in Locke's vision, are grounded in a pre-political moral order? They are not permissions issued by the state. They are boundaries the state must respect. When governments expand surveillance, regulate speech, or restrict movement, They often justify it as necessary for collective good. Locke would ask a sharper question. Does this action protect natural rights, or does it erode them? The legitimacy of authority hinges on that answer. The psychological dimension here is severe. Human beings fear vulnerability. In the state of nature, without centralized enforcement, insecurity looms. The temptation to surrender freedom for safety is powerful. Even today, individuals trade privacy for convenience, autonomy for stability. The promise of protection seduces. But Locke forces us to ask, protection at what cost? If freedom is original, then every limitation demands justification, not emotional appeal, not abstract necessity, clear alignment with the preservation of natural rights. Without that, authority mutates into domination. Consider the internal parallel. Within yourself, you experience a similar tension. You desire autonomy. You want to direct your life. Yet you also seek structures that reduce uncertainty, routine, rules, external validation. The psyche mirrors the state of nature. Freedom contains risk. Structure contains constraint. Do you surrender your inner liberty for the comfort of imposed order? Locke's framework reveals that the problem of political authority is an extension of existential anxiety. We fear chaos. We crave security. We construct systems. But if those systems erase the very freedom they were meant to safeguard, they betray their purpose. The state of nature is not merely a historical hypothesis. It is a conceptual mirror. It asks you to imagine yourself stripped of institutions. No government, no inherited titles, no social scripts. Only you, your reason, and others equally free. What justifies one person commanding another in that condition? Nothing. That is the force of equality. This equality does not deny differences in ability or intelligence. It denies moral superiority at birth. It denies that power can be natural in the sense of pre-political entitlement. Authority must be constructed, not presumed. And once constructed, it remains conditional. The radical implication is this: sovereignty does not descend from heaven. It ascends from individuals. The community, formed by equal persons, becomes the source of political power, not because it is infallible, but because no single individual possesses innate dominion. This transition from natural equality to collective authority will require explanation. But before that shift can occur, the dignity of the individual must be secured. Locke's insistence on natural rights also reshapes moral responsibility. If every person owns himself, then every person bears responsibility for his actions. You cannot attribute your wrongdoing to inherited subordination. You cannot claim that your life belongs to another's design. Autonomy entails accountability. Freedom is heavy. Modern culture often speaks of equality in terms of outcomes. Locke speaks of equality in terms of origin and authority. You begin with the same moral status as any other human being. No one stands above you by nature. No one stands below you by destiny. Yet this equality also means that you owe the same respect to others that you demand for yourself. You cannot claim natural liberty while denying it to another. The law of nature binds all equally. Here, the existential tension intensifies. To accept that no one has natural authority over you is empowering. To accept that you have no natural authority over others is restraining. The ego resists this symmetry. It prefers dominance or submission, clarity of hierarchy, relief from ambiguity. But equality dissolves illusion. It confronts you with the fact that every other person is as fundamentally free as you are. This is difficult to live with. In intimate relationships, in workplaces, in political movements, the impulse to dominate surfaces quickly. We justify control as competence. We disguise superiority as necessity. Yet, beneath these rationalizations lies a denial of original equality. Locke's state of nature exposes that denial. He does not claim that human beings will always act according to reason. He acknowledges conflict, aggression, injustice. But these do not negate equality. They violate it. And violation implies a standard that precedes the act. The existence of wrongdoing presupposes a moral law. Now, imagine a society that forgets this origin. Imagine a culture that treats rights as temporary grants, revocable at will. Imagine a system where equality is rhetorical, but power operates as if some lives weigh more than others. Such a society drifts towards soft despotism, even if elections remain. The state of nature becomes a diagnostic tool. It reminds us what is lost when authority forgets its foundation. And yet, the instability within that natural condition remains unresolved. If every individual has the right to enforce natural law, if disputes multiply, if insecurity persists, then reason itself pushes toward a solution. Not the abandonment of equality, but its preservation through structure. The question sharpens. How can free and equal individuals secure their rights without surrendering the very freedom that defines them? How can they create order without manufacturing tyranny? How can they establish authority that remains servant rather than master? The answer cannot lie in divine mandate. It cannot lie in inherited privilege. It must arise from the consent of those who were originally free. And once we step toward that collective agreement, another force emerges from within the individual condition itself, a force tied not only to survival and liberty, but to the tangible fruits of human effort, to the way a person extends himself into the world through work and claims something as his own. Property is not born from decree, it is born from labor. Once free and equal individuals stand in the state of nature, owning themselves and bound by reason, another question forces itself forward. If the earth is given to all in common, if no one has natural dominion over another, how does anything become mine? How does the shared world transform into personal possession without violating equality? John Locke answers with a claim that cuts through abstraction. A person owns his own body. He owns his labor. And when he mixes that labor with something in the natural world, he makes it his property. This is not a sentimental theory. It is an ontological argument. The first branch of his reasoning begins with self-ownership. If you own yourself, then you own the work produced by your body and mind. Your effort is not a floating abstraction. It is an extension of your being. When you gather fruit, cultivate land, build shelter, you do not merely rearrange matter. You project yourself into it. Labor is the bridge between self and world. To deny the product of your labor is to deny your ownership of yourself. Locke strips away confusion here. Property is not initially created by law. It is created by action. Before any government marks boundaries or issues titles, the act of labor establishes a moral claim. If you harvest apples from a tree in the state of nature, those apples become yours, because your effort removed them from common use and tied them to your survival. This is the origin. The second branch clarifies the limits. Locke does not grant unlimited accumulation. He imposes conditions. One may appropriate from nature only as much as one can use before it spoils. One must leave enough and as good for others. Property emerges through labor, but it remains bounded by reason and by the rights of others. This detail matters. The common misunderstanding is that Locke justifies greed without restraint. That is false. His early formulation restricts hoarding. Waste violates natural law. Appropriation is legitimate only when it enhances preservation, not when it deprives others of equal opportunity. Property is tied to survival and improvement, not domination. The third branch introduces a transformation. With the invention of money, durable and non-perishable, individuals can accumulate beyond immediate use. By mutual consent, societies accept gold or silver as stores of value. This tacit agreement allows inequality of holdings without immediate violation of spoilage limits. Here, the terrain shifts. Money expands the scale of property. It enables accumulation. It creates economic complexity. But it also introduces tension. Once accumulation exceeds simple survival, the relationship between labor, value, and fairness becomes strained. Locke does not deny this strain. He grounds legitimacy in consent. If individuals freely participate in a system where money represents value, then expanded holdings are not theft, but consequence of agreement. Yet the moral question remains alive. Now confront the psychological depth of this theory. When a human being labors, he does not merely secure resources. He seeks affirmation of agency. Work becomes proof of autonomy. To transform raw nature into something shaped by effort is to assert existence. Property becomes a mirror of freedom. You feel this even now. When you create something, when you build, write, design, cultivate, you experience ownership not as legal abstraction, but as extension of self. Someone else claiming your work feels like violation, not because of profit alone, but because your labor carries your identity. Locke understands this instinct, but here is the confrontation. If property is extension of self, then the hunger for property can metastasize into hunger for validation. Accumulation becomes substitute for meaning. In 2025, the economy rewards scale. Ownership is measured in numbers that dwarf necessity. The line between preservation and obsession blurs. Does your labor still serve life, or has life become servant of acquisition? Locke's original formulation demands that property arise from productive effort. Labor creates value. Idle possession without contribution lacks moral foundation. This principle challenges both inherited aristocracy and parasitic exploitation. No one deserves ownership merely by birth. No one deserves wealth without engagement. The moral claim to property rests on participation in the transformation of the world. This demolishes the myth of natural economic hierarchy. Yet another tension surfaces. Not all labor yields equal reward. Not all effort receives equal recognition. Inequality persists. Locke does not promise uniform outcome. He promises equal starting authority over oneself, an equal right to appropriate through effort. The modern mind resists this simplicity. We see structural complexities, historical injustices, global disparities, and they are real. But beneath them lies the foundational claim. Property is not mystical entitlement. It is rooted in human action. This forces a question inward. What have you truly earned through labor? And what have you inherited without reflection? What do you call yours that you did not shape? And if property extends the self, what does your accumulation reveal about your inner structure? Locke's theory also binds property to liberty. If you own your labor and its fruits, then secure property becomes shield for freedom. Without control over resources, autonomy collapses. Dependence breeds submission. Economic vulnerability invites political domination. Property becomes a buffer against tyranny. But property can also become an instrument of tyranny. When accumulation concentrates power, when ownership translates into coercive influence, equality erodes. The delicate balance between self-ownership and collective stability strains. Locke's solution is not abolition of property. It is legitimate political authority grounded in consent, designed to protect natural rights, including property, while preventing arbitrary seizure. Yet before such authority exists, the moral logic must be clear. Labor creates entitlement. Entitlement remains bounded by reason. Accumulation beyond necessity becomes permissible through shared agreement. Strip this down to its existential core. You are not merely a consciousness floating in abstraction. You are embodied. You act. You exert effort. The world resists you. Through labor, you carve space for survival and dignity. Property, in this sense, is crystallized effort. To attack legitimate property is to attack the person. But to treat property as ultimate purpose is to shrink the person to possession. Locke walks this tightrope. In contemporary life, work often detaches from tangible creation. Digital labor, symbolic production, financial abstraction. The connection between effort and visible transformation weakens. Value becomes numerical. Ownership becomes data entry. Does this erode the psychological link between labor and identity? Or does it intensify alienation? When you cannot see the direct imprint of your effort, your sense of ownership becomes fragile. You may cling to external validation. You may measure worth in accumulated symbols rather than meaningful contribution. Locke's framework demands clarity. What did your labor genuinely transform? What did you truly mix yourself with? If ownership is extension of self, then shallow labor produces shallow identity. There is another layer. The requirement to leave enough and as good for others echoes today in debates about resource depletion and environmental crisis. If appropriation destroys the conditions for others to live freely, it violates the original moral boundary. The earth is common in origin. Labor grants claim, but not annihilation of shared future. The tension between individual appropriation and collective sustainability is not modern invention. It is embedded in the theory from the beginning. Now return to the individual psyche. Labor disciplines desire. It teaches effort, patience, limitation. When property flows disconnected from effort, character weakens. Entitlement replaces responsibility. Conversely, when effort never yields security, resentment grows. Both extremes corrode equality. Locke's insistence that property arises from labor is therefore ethical training. It aligns reward with action. It ties freedom to contribution. It resists both inherited privilege and forced collectivism. Yet as accumulation expands through money and markets, complexity increases. Exchange multiplies. Cooperation deepens. Conflict over possession intensifies. Disputes over boundaries and contracts emerge. The state of nature, once manageable through individual enforcement of natural law, strains under economic density. Here, the instability returns. If property is extension of self, and disputes over property threaten security, then a neutral authority becomes necessary. Not to create property, but to protect it. Not to invent rights, but to safeguard them. The right to life, liberty, and estate converge. And so the logic that began with self-ownership and labor now presses toward institutional structure. Free and equal individuals, seeking preservation of their lives and possessions, must consider how to establish common rules without surrendering their original authority. The problem sharpens. How can individuals who own themselves and the fruits of their labor join together in a way that secures property without dissolving freedom? How can they create a power strong enough to adjudicate disputes, yet limited enough to avoid becoming a predator over the very rights it was formed to defend? Government is not born from heaven. It is forged from consent. Once free and equal individuals recognize the fragility of their condition, once they understand that self-ownership and property require protection beyond personal enforcement, the next movement becomes inevitable. They must unite, not to surrender their nature, but to secure it, not to kneel before a ruler, but to construct a power that serves them. John Locke's claim is uncompromising. Political society arises only through agreement. There is no mystical transformation from chaos to authority. There is no divine infusion of sovereignty. There is a decision. Individuals consent to form a community. From that community, government emerges. This is the axis. The first branch of his argument is clear. In the state of nature, each person possesses executive power over natural law. Each judges violations. Each enforces punishment. This universality produces conflict and insecurity. To remedy this, individuals agree to transfer that executive power to a common authority. They do not transfer their natural rights. They transfer the enforcement of those rights. This distinction is everything. You do not give up your life, your liberty, your property when you enter political society. You entrust their protection to an impartial structure. The social contract is not self-annihilation. It is strategic delegation. Power becomes a trust. The second branch exposes a misunderstanding that has haunted political history. Consent is not silent submission to conquest. It is not fear disguised as agreement. Genuine political legitimacy requires voluntary participation, either explicit or tacit. The individual must recognize the authority as binding because he has, directly or indirectly, accepted its framework. Without consent, rule is force. Locke does not romanticize unanimity. Once a community is formed, majority decision becomes necessary. Otherwise, collective action collapses. But majority rule does not erase the foundational principle. The authority of the majority flows from the prior agreement of individuals to act as one body. The community becomes a moral person, but its life is sustained by the will of its members. The third branch sharpens the limit. Because government arises to protect natural rights, it cannot legitimately violate them. Its purpose defines its boundary. If authority oversteps, if it attacks life, liberty, or estate instead of preserving them, it dissolves its own legitimacy. Power is conditional. This is the revolutionary core hidden beneath calm prose. Kings once claimed sacred right. Locke responds with a blade. Show me the consent. Show me the protective function. If you cannot, your crown rests on air. Now confront the existential weight of this idea. To enter a social contract is to accept limitation for the sake of preservation. You relinquish the personal right to exact revenge. You submit disputes to law. You obey regulations that bind everyone equally. This requires trust. It requires faith that the collective structure will not mutate into predator. The human psyche resists this vulnerability. You fear losing autonomy. You fear being absorbed into a faceless system, and yet you also fear the insecurity of isolation. The social contract is born from this tension. It is the rational answer to mutual vulnerability. In 2025, governments are vast, bureaucratic, technologically empowered. The distance between citizen and institution can feel immense. Consent becomes abstract. Participation shrinks to periodic voting or digital acknowledgement of terms no one reads. The original clarity of agreement fades, but the principle remains ruthless. Authority is legitimate only insofar as it protects the rights it was formed to secure. Ask yourself, do you experience your government as guardian of your freedom or as manager of your obedience? Do laws feel like rational structures preserving equality or like mechanisms of control? Consent cannot be reduced to habit. It must be continually justified by function. Locke's vision demands vigilance. There is also a deeper psychological contract within each individual. You construct internal rules to govern your impulses. You surrender certain immediate freedoms for long-term stability. You create habits, disciplines, boundaries. These internal laws arise from a kind of self-consent. You agree with yourself to live by certain principles. But what happens when those internal authorities become tyrannical? When self-discipline turns into self-repression? When structures meant to preserve your integrity begin to suffocate it? The parallel is precise. Just as political power is a trust, so is internal authority. It must serve your flourishing, not crush it. The logic of the social contract reflects the logic of psychological coherence. Return to the political plane. Locke's insistence on consent dismantles hereditary absolutism. No one is born subject to a ruler without choice. Even children, as they mature, must implicitly consent to remain within a political community. Residence, participation, enjoyment of protection constitute tacit acceptance. This concept is not simplistic. Critics argue that true freedom to leave is often limited. But Locke's aim is not to describe perfect conditions. It is to establish a moral standard. Authority requires the continuing acceptance of those governed, and acceptance is tied to benefit. The state exists to secure rights more effectively than individuals could alone. It provides known laws, impartial judges, and power to enforce decisions. These are the three deficiencies of the state of nature that government corrects. When these functions degrade, legitimacy erodes. Notice the austerity of this framework. Government is not divine teacher, not moral redeemer, not architect of souls. Its role is defined and narrow: preservation of natural rights. The expansion of power beyond that mandate invites corruption. Modern states often claim broader missions: economic engineering, cultural shaping, psychological management. The language of protection expands into the language of optimization. Yet every extension must be measured against the original trust. Does this action secure life, liberty, and property, or does it instrumentalize citizens for abstract goals? The temptation of rulers is perennial: to reinterpret consent as permanent surrender, to treat delegated power as inherent superiority. Locke rejects this at its root. Power remains borrowed. Borrowed power must answer to its source. This idea transforms the citizen from subject to principal. You are not passive recipient of authority. You are co-author of its existence. Even if you never consciously signed a contract, the moral structure presumes your participation. But participation demands awareness. If citizens drift into apathy, if they forget the conditional nature of authority, if they treat government as natural fact rather than constructed instrument, the social contract ossifies into silent domination. The psychological mechanism is familiar. Comfort breeds complacency. Security dulls scrutiny. Gradually, trust becomes unquestioning acceptance. Power expands quietly. Locke's theory is not self-executing. It requires active reason. Another tension surfaces here. The social contract requires individuals to subordinate some private judgments to public decision. Majority rule binds dissenters. This can feel oppressive, yet without this mechanism, collective action dissolves. The challenge is balance. Sufficient authority to maintain order, sufficient limitation to prevent abuse. And beneath this institutional design lies a deeper philosophical truth. Human beings are not solitary atoms. They are relational. Their rights and freedoms find stability only within structured coexistence. Absolute independence is illusion. Absolute dependence is degradation. The social contract navigates between these extremes. You do not lose your freedom by entering society. You redefine it within a network of mutual obligation. But obligation without consent becomes chains. Locke's insistence on agreement protects dignity. It affirms that even when you obey law, you do so as participant, not slave. The legitimacy of punishment rests on prior consent to the system that defines crime. This reframes authority entirely. The state does not stand above the people as master. It stands among them as trustee. And trustees can betray. Once we accept that political power is delegated and conditional, a final question sharpens like steel. What happens when the trust is broken? What happens when the government designed to preserve rights begins to undermine them? When laws become arbitrary? When judges become partial? When enforcement turns predatory? If authority derives from consent, and consent was granted for protection, then violation of that purpose fractures the contract itself. At that point, the people who once united to escape insecurity must confront a new insecurity created by the very power they formed. And the logic of preservation, once directed against the chaos of the state of nature, turns toward a different danger, the danger of concentrated power exceeding its mandate and forgetting that it was never meant to be sovereign in its own right. Power without limits is legalized violence. Once government is formed by consent, one's authority is entrusted with the protection of life, liberty, and property, a new danger emerges. The very structure designed to shield rights can become the instrument that destroys them. Delegated power has a tendency to forget that it is delegated. It begins to speak in its own name. It begins to expand. John Locke confronts this with ruthless clarity. The state is not sovereign in itself. It is bounded by purpose. Its reason for existence defines its perimeter. When it crosses that perimeter, it ceases to function as legitimate authority and begins to resemble the threat it was meant to prevent. The first limit is functional. Government exists to preserve natural rights, not to redesign human nature, not to command conscience, not to reshape existence according to ideological ambition. Its task is specific: secure the conditions under which free and equal individuals can live without fear of arbitrary harm. If a law does not serve that preservation, its legitimacy is questionable. The second limit is structural. Law must be established and known. It cannot be arbitrary. It cannot shift with the moods of rulers. Locke insists that legitimate authority operates through general rules applied equally. When decrees replace laws, when personal will replaces impartial judgment, the social contract fractures. Arbitrariness is the seed of tyranny. This principle is not abstract. In 2025, policies are drafted at speed, regulations layered upon regulations, executive powers justified by emergency after emergency. The language is often protective: security, stability, efficiency. But the essential question remains unchanged. Are these measures bound by consistent law, or do they concentrate discretion in the hands of a few? When power becomes discretionary rather than rule-bound, freedom contracts. The third limit is institutional division. Locke anticipates a principle that later thinkers will refine. Power must be separated. Legislative authority creates laws. Executive authority enforces them. When these functions collapse into a single entity, temptation multiplies. The maker of law becomes the interpreter of its own boundaries. The enforcer becomes judge of its own conduct. Unchecked unity breeds abuse. Division does not guarantee virtue. It creates friction. It slows action. It frustrates efficiency. But this friction is intentional. It forces deliberation. It prevents rapid descent into domination. It acknowledges that human beings entrusted with power remain fallible. Remember the earlier insight. Human knowledge has limits. If rulers are not omniscient, why grant them unlimited authority? Epistemic humility must translate into political restraint. Locke's reasoning cuts deep into the psychology of governance. Power intoxicates. Even well-intentioned leaders begin to believe that their perspective is uniquely clear. They convince themselves that extraordinary circumstances justify extraordinary authority. Over time, exception becomes norm. Without limits, trust decays. The fourth limit is fiduciary. Government holds power in trust for the people. This is not poetic metaphor. It is moral architecture. A trustee cannot use assets for personal gain. A trustee cannot redefine the purpose of the trust unilaterally. Authority must remain aligned with the ends for which it was granted. When officials act for private interest, factional advantage, or self-preservation at the expense of public rights, they violate this trust. Consider the internal parallel again. Within yourself, you possess drives, ambitions, impulses. You construct rules to govern them. If one impulse gains dominance without restraint, it distorts your character. Desire unchecked becomes addiction. Fear unchecked becomes paranoia. Pride unchecked becomes cruelty. Your internal order requires balance and limit. So too with political order. The law must apply equally. This equality is not sentimental. It is structural necessity. If rulers exempt themselves from the rules imposed on citizens, the fiction of common consent collapses. Two classes emerge: those who command and those who obey. The original equality of the state of nature dissolves. Locke will not allow this. He understands that the moment government positions itself above the law, it reverts to the very condition individuals sought to escape. The difference is scale. Instead of many individuals exercising biased judgment, one centralized authority exercises biased dominance. Which is more dangerous? The temptation of centralized power is always justified in the language of necessity. Crisis demands speed. Threat demands unity. Dissent appears irresponsible. Yet every expansion must answer the foundational question: does this serve the preservation of natural rights, or does it erode them? Fear is the most reliable ally of overreach. Human beings fear instability. They fear violence. They fear uncertainty. Leaders can manipulate this fear, presenting concentration of power as protection. Citizens, anxious for safety, acquiesce. Gradually, temporary measures harden into permanent authority. Locke's limits are designed to resist this drift. There is another dimension. Law must be prospective, not retroactive. Individuals must know the rules under which they live. Hidden standards, secret interpretations, shifting definitions undermine freedom. You cannot be free if you cannot foresee the consequences of your actions. Predictability is dignity. In 2025, algorithmic governance complicates this principle. Decisions are increasingly mediated by systems opaque to ordinary citizens. If rules are embedded in code, inaccessible to public scrutiny, does this align with Locke's requirement of known law? If enforcement mechanisms operate through automated surveillance, where does accountability reside? The form changes, the principle does not. Limits are not obstacles to governance. They are its legitimacy. Now confront the existential layer. To live under limited government requires maturity. Citizens must tolerate procedural delays. They must accept that not every desired outcome will be immediately achieved. They must endure disagreement within institutional channels rather than demanding swift, decisive action at any cost. Impatience feeds absolutism. Many crave strong leaders because they promise clarity and speed. Complexity exhausts. Debate frustrates. But speed without boundary leads to irreversible harm. Locke's framework values restraint over spectacle. This is not weakness, it is discipline. And discipline is rooted in recognition of human fallibility. No ruler is pure reason. No assembly is immune to bias. Therefore, power must be chained to law, divided across functions, accountable to the people. When these chains loosen, the structure shifts suddenly. Laws multiply beyond necessity. Enforcement grows selective. Exceptions are carved for the powerful. Public justification becomes ritual rather than reality. At that point, citizens sense something eroding but struggle to name it. They feel constrained, yet are told they are protected. They obey, yet feel diminished. The betrayal is gradual. Locke's insistence on limit is a warning. Authority is justified only while it serves its defined end. It must remain transparent. It must remain general. It must remain accountable. But what if it does not? What if the legislative power begins to rule by decree? What if the executive manipulates enforcement to silence opposition? What if the judiciary aligns with power rather than restraining it? What if the trust is no longer honored? The logic circles back to its origin. If government was formed to escape the inconveniences of the state of nature, but now becomes a greater threat than those inconveniences, the people face a stark reality. The condition they sought to avoid reappears in altered form. Arbitrary power returns, this time centralized and legitimized by habit. At that moment, the question can no longer be deferred. When the guardian becomes the aggressor, when law becomes instrument of oppression, when limits dissolve into ambition, what recourse remains to those who were originally free and equal, and who never surrendered their natural right to preserve themselves? When power betrays its purpose, obedience becomes complicity. If government is a trust, then violation of that trust is not a minor defect. It is a fracture at the foundation. John Locke does not whisper this conclusion. He drives it forward with unflinching logic. When authority acts against the preservation of life, liberty, and property, it dissolves the bond that legitimized it. At that moment, the people retain a right older than the state itself, the right to resist. This is not rebellion born of impulse. It is not chaos disguised as courage. It is the final safeguard of freedom. The first principle is clear. Political power exists by consent. If rulers attempt to destroy the rights they were appointed to protect, they place themselves in a state of war against the people. They revert to the condition of aggressors, and against aggression, self-preservation becomes lawful. Resistance is not the rejection of order. It is the defense of the original order. Locke understands the gravity of this claim. He does not encourage instability. He does not celebrate constant uprising. He emphasizes restraint. Minor abuses do not justify revolt. Human institutions are imperfect. Errors occur. Frustrations accumulate. But when a pattern emerges, when design replaces accident, when violations reveal intention to dominate rather than protect, the moral equation shifts. The second principle deepens the argument. Sovereignty ultimately resides in the community, not in the ruler, not in the office, not in the apparatus of force. The people formed the government. They entrusted power for specific ends. If those ends are abandoned, the authority reverts to its source. Power flows upward from individuals. It does not descend permanently from thrones. This is a terrifying thought for rulers. It is a sobering thought for citizens, because it means responsibility cannot be outsourced. If authority collapses into tyranny, the people must decide whether to endure or to act. Freedom demands courage, but courage is not romantic. The third principle reveals Locke's realism. He acknowledges that rulers will accuse dissenters of sedition. They will frame resistance as disorder. They will claim that stability requires submission. Yet stability without justice is disguised oppression. Peace without liberty is silent suffocation. The right of resistance exists precisely because human beings are fallible, because power tempts, because ambition corrupts, because fear manipulates. No constitutional design, no institutional division, no procedural safeguard can guarantee perpetual virtue. Therefore, the final check rests with the people themselves. Ask yourself, would you recognize tyranny if it grew gradually, or would you adapt? Would you rationalize each incremental expansion of control? Would you tell yourself that order is more important than freedom? In 2025, resistance rarely appears as open revolution. It surfaces as protest, whistleblowing, civil disobedience, refusal to comply with unjust mandates. The forms evolve. The principle remains. Yet here lies the psychological tension. Human beings fear conflict. They fear instability more than quiet erosion. The cost of resistance can be high: reputation, security, comfort. It is easier to endure mild injustice than to confront authority directly. Locke knows this. He trusts that people will not revolt for trivial reasons. They cling to order until violation becomes undeniable. This is why he rejects the accusation that his theory breeds constant upheaval. On the contrary, he argues that people are naturally inclined to suffer rather than rebel. Only long trains of abuses awaken collective action. But when awakening occurs, it is decisive. The moral structure is sharp. if government dissolves the legislative body without consent, if it prevents representation, if it manipulates elections, if it places itself above the law, if it uses force to suppress lawful rights, it declares war on its own foundation. And war, in Locke's language, is not merely physical violence. It is the use of force without right. Here, the existential dimension deepens. To resist authority is to confront fear. Fear of punishment, fear of chaos, fear of uncertainty. Yet to submit to injustice is to erode one's own dignity. The internal conflict mirrors the political one. Safety against self-respect, comfort against integrity. What is the value of a quiet life if it is lived under silent domination? Locke does not promise that resistance will succeed. He does not guarantee that revolution leads to paradise. He simply insists that the right remains. Because without that right, government becomes absolute. An absolute government contradicts the original equality of persons. The right of resistance is the shadow of consent. Remove one, and the other loses meaning. Notice the balance. Locke does not glorify violence. He presents resistance as last resort. Only when legal remedies are blocked. Only when institutions fail. Only when the pattern of abuse reveals intention. This is not impulsive reaction. It is reasoned defense. Still, the threshold is subjective. Different citizens perceive injustice differently. Some tolerate more, some less. This is the unavoidable ambiguity of human judgment. There is no mechanical formula that announces the precise moment of legitimate revolt. Freedom requires discernment, and discernment requires moral courage. Consider the internal analogy once more. Within yourself, when habits begin to destroy your integrity, when patterns of thought erode your autonomy, there comes a moment when you must resist your own internal tyranny. No external savior intervenes. You confront the destructive force directly. You reclaim authority over your life. Political resistance mirrors this inner reclamation. Yet there is danger here as well. Not all claims of resistance are just. Ambition can disguise itself as liberation. Personal grievance can masquerade as moral principle. Locke's framework demands that resistance aim at restoration of rights, not replacement of one domination with another. The objective is preservation of natural law, not perpetual upheaval. In modern discourse, revolution is often romanticized or demonized. Locke avoids both extremes. He grounds it in necessity. If the government destroys the conditions for lawful preservation, the people resume the authority they originally held. This is not destruction of society. It is reconstruction. But reconstruction is costly. It demands unity among the oppressed. It demands clarity of purpose. It demands that the new structure avoid the vices of the old. The risk of replacing one tyrant with another is real. History confirms it repeatedly. Therefore, the right of resistance is not invitation to chaos. It is a final safeguard anchored in natural rights. Let the implications settle. If rulers know that their authority depends on ongoing consent, they govern cautiously. If citizens know that they retain ultimate sovereignty, they remain vigilant. The dynamic tension between power and people sustains liberty. Remove the right of resistance, and fear replaces trust. Remove trust, and authority relies solely on force. At that point, the social contract collapses into domination. But another dimension surfaces here. Resistance is not always collective. It begins within conscience. Before crowds gather, individuals must recognize injustice internally. They must name it. They must refuse to normalize it. Silence, too, is a choice. And conscience cannot be coerced without destroying personhood itself. Which leads to another frontier. If government exists to secure external rights, and if resistance protects those rights against overreach, what of the realm that lies beyond coercion entirely? What of belief, conviction, faith? Can authority command the inner domain? Can it dictate the allegiance of the soul? The struggle against tyranny does not end at property or political representation. It reaches into the invisible terrain of conscience, where force proves powerless, and where freedom, if genuine, must be absolute. The soul cannot be ruled by force. Once the right of resistance is acknowledged, once the people are recognized as the ultimate guardians of their own liberty, another boundary becomes unavoidable. Political authority may regulate actions. It may adjudicate disputes. It may protect property. But can it command belief? Can it legislate conviction? Can it dictate what a person must hold as sacred within the silent interior of conscience? John Locke answers without hesitation. No. The first principle is stark. Faith is an inward persuasion of the mind. It cannot be manufactured by external pressure. True belief arises from conviction, not coercion. A government may compel outward conformity. It may demand attendance, impose penalties, silence dissent. But it cannot force genuine assent. At most, it produces hypocrisy. Coerced religion is counterfeit religion. This insight dismantles centuries of persecution justified in the name of unity. Before tolerance became fashionable language, Locke defended it as logical necessity. If the purpose of government is to preserve civil interests, then it exceeds its jurisdiction when it attempts to govern souls. The second principle clarifies the distinction. The state concerns itself with civil goods, life, liberty, property, public order. The church, or any religious community, concerns itself with salvation, worship, moral teaching. These are separate spheres. Confusion between them breeds oppression. When rulers claim authority over eternal destiny, they overstep their mandate. This separation is not hostility toward religion. It is protection for it. Faith compelled by sword loses authenticity. Faith chosen freely retains integrity. Locke does not deny the importance of spiritual life. He denies the competence of political power to regulate it. The third principle intensifies the demand. Tolerance is not mere indulgence. It is recognition of epistemic limitation. Recall the earlier truth. Human knowledge has boundaries. No individual, no ruler possesses infallible access to divine will. To persecute others for doctrinal error assumes certainty that no mortal can legitimately claim. Dogmatism armed with power becomes cruelty. Now confront the present condition. In 2025, overt religious persecution may be less common in some regions, yet the impulse to control conscience persists in new forms. Ideological conformity replaces theological uniformity. Social pressure enforces orthodoxy. Dissent from dominant narratives invites exclusion. The mechanism changes, the psychology remains. Human beings fear divergence. They crave cohesion. They interpret disagreement as threat. Authority, whether political or cultural, exploits this fear by demanding alignment. But conscience is not territory to be occupied. Locke's argument reaches deeper than institutional arrangement. It touches the structure of personhood. To believe is to judge internally. It is to evaluate reasons, evidence, testimony. If that judgment is replaced by fear of punishment, the act ceases to be belief and becomes performance. Can a forced prayer reach heaven? Can a coerced confession save a soul? The absurdity reveals the truth. There is also a pragmatic dimension. Religious persecution destabilizes society. When the state attempts to impose uniform doctrine, it generates resistance, resentment, and fragmentation. Tolerance, by contrast, allows diverse convictions to coexist under shared civil law. Peace requires restraint. But Locke's tolerance is not boundless. He excludes those who undermine civil order or deny the very principles of trust that sustain society. His framework remains grounded in preservation of rights. Tolerance cannot extend to forces that seek to annihilate tolerance itself. Here, the balance becomes delicate. Absolute relativism dissolves moral coherence. Absolute uniformity crushes freedom. Locke navigates between them by anchoring tolerance in natural rights. As long as a belief does not translate into violation of life, liberty, or property, it lies beyond the reach of political coercion. This principle confronts the modern psyche with discomfort. We often demand that others not only obey the law, but share our convictions. We equate disagreement with hostility. We seek validation through uniformity. Yet genuine freedom requires endurance of difference. Are you capable of allowing beliefs you consider wrong to exist without attempting to silence them? Tolerance is not approval, it is discipline. Internally, this reflects another struggle. Within your own mind, conflicting thoughts compete. Doubts challenge inherited doctrines. Questions unsettle certainty. If you suppress them violently, you fracture your integrity. If you allow examination, your belief, if it survives, becomes stronger. Political tolerance mirrors intellectual humility. Locke's defense of freedom of conscience rests on recognition that salvation cannot be outsourced. Each individual must answer for his own belief. The magistrate cannot believe on your behalf. Therefore, the magistrate cannot justly compel belief. The dignity of conscience is inviolable. Yet, this dignity carries responsibility. Freedom of belief does not absolve moral accountability. You remain responsible for actions flowing from your convictions. The state may not police your inner assent, but it may restrain harmful behavior. This distinction is crucial. When authority collapses belief and action into a single category, tyranny grows. When society collapses disagreement into enmity, intolerance spreads. Locke's framework protects inner freedom while maintaining external order. Now consider the existential weight. To possess freedom of conscience means standing alone before truth. You cannot hide behind collective enforcement. You cannot excuse belief by claiming coercion. Your conviction is yours. Your doubt is yours. Your error is yours. Freedom isolates as much as it liberates, but isolation is the price of authenticity. In a pluralistic society, multiple faiths, philosophies, and worldviews coexist. This diversity can feel unstable. It challenges identity. It forces dialogue. Yet without it, belief ossifies into imposed habit. Locke's insistence on toleration anticipates a world of difference. It provides a moral structure for coexistence without uniformity. It acknowledges that peace does not require sameness. And still, beneath doctrinal disputes and public debates lies a deeper question about what constitutes the self that believes. If conscience cannot be coerced, if belief resides in inner awareness, then what is this awareness that persists through change? What makes a person the same moral agent across time, accountable for past convictions and present choices? The inquiry moves inward again, from the freedom to believe toward the continuity of the one who believes. Personal identity is not anchored in the body or the soul. It is anchored in consciousness. Once freedom of conscience is secured, once belief is recognized as an inward act beyond coercion, a deeper problem surfaces. Who is the one who believes? Who is the subject that owns conviction, that carries responsibility across time, that stands before law and morality as the same being yesterday and today? John Locke answers with precision that unsettles tradition. Personal identity does not consist in substance, not in the immaterial soul, not in the material body. It consists in continuity of consciousness. This is not poetic speculation. It is analytic dissection. The first movement of his argument separates the idea of a human being from the idea of a person. A human being may be defined biologically as a living organism with a particular structure. A soul may be defined metaphysically as an immaterial substance. But a person, Locke insists, is a thinking, intelligent being that can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places. Selfhood is self-awareness extended through memory. The second movement sharpens the claim. If consciousness can be transferred, if the same awareness could inhabit a different body, identity would follow consciousness, not flesh. Conversely, if the same body persisted but consciousness did not, the person would not remain the same in moral sense. This fractures inherited assumptions. You feel continuity because you remember. You claim responsibility for past actions because you can recall performing them. Memory binds moments into a single narrative thread. Without memory, there is no ownership of deed. Identity is narrative coherence. The third movement confronts moral accountability. Praise and blame attach not to substance, but to conscious agent. If you have no awareness of an action, if it lies entirely outside your present consciousness, can you be morally responsible for it? Locke pushes this question to its edge. Responsibility requires psychological connection. This does not dissolve ethics. It grounds it in awareness. Now confront the existential weight. If you are your consciousness, then you are not a static entity. You are a flowing stream of perception, reflection, memory. Your body changes, your cells renew, your beliefs evolve. What persists is the thread of awareness connecting experiences into unity. But how stable is that thread? Memory is fragile. It distorts, it forgets, it edits. In 2025, digital archives record fragments of life with ruthless permanence. Yet internal memory remains selective. You remember selectively. You reinterpret the past. You construct identity through narrative emphasis. Are you the same person you were 10 years ago? In body, partly. In consciousness, perhaps only partially. Yet you claim continuity. Locke's theory forces you to examine that claim. If identity rests on consciousness, then selfhood requires reflection. Without active remembrance, without integration of past into present awareness, the self fragments. You become a series of disconnected moments rather than a coherent moral agent. Modern distraction intensifies this fragmentation. Constant stimulation interrupts reflection. Experience accumulates without integration. Memory becomes shallow. The thread thins. What happens to responsibility when awareness erodes? Locke's framework reveals that moral life depends on continuity of consciousness. To be accountable, you must recognize yourself as the one who acted. Guilt and pride both presuppose memory. Without it, praise and blame lose their target. This has legal implications, theological implications, psychological implications. But at its core lies a stark truth. You are the story you can remember as yours. Yet there is tension here. Memory can deceive. False recollections arise. Trauma suppresses events. Self-narrative shifts to protect ego. If identity depends on memory, and memory is unstable, then identity is precarious. Locke does not deny this fragility. He embraces it. He separates the idea of person from the idea of substance, precisely to ground accountability in experience rather than metaphysical speculation. Whether the soul is the same substance is secondary. What matters is conscious awareness of action. This reorients moral discourse. You are not responsible because you possess a certain metaphysical essence. You are responsible because you know yourself as the one who chose. Choice binds consciousness to consequence. Now examine your own inner life. When you recall a mistake, you feel ownership because the memory carries your perspective. When you recall a triumph, You experience continuity because you can re-inhabit the intention that produced it. Without that reflective return, the event becomes alien. Identity is reappropriation. This has profound implications for growth. To change is not to erase the past, but to reinterpret it consciously. You integrate previous selves into present awareness. You do not deny them. You contextualize them. If you refuse memory, you escape responsibility. If you obsess over memory, you freeze growth. Balance requires acknowledgement without captivity. Locke's insight also intersects with freedom of conscience. If belief resides in inner awareness, and identity resides in continuity of that awareness, then coercion that disrupts self-recognition becomes assault on personhood itself. To manipulate memory, to distort narrative, to rewrite history forcibly is to attack identity. Control of memory is control of self. In 2025, this risk appears not only through state propaganda, but through algorithmic curation. Digital feeds remind you of selected memories. They highlight certain moments. They suppress others. Gradually, external systems participate in shaping your narrative continuity. Who authors your identity? If you are the thread of consciousness, then preserving autonomy requires active reflection. You must choose which memories define you. You must examine which narratives you accept. Locke's theory does not offer comfort. It offers clarity. You are not an immutable core hidden beneath change. You are the ongoing awareness that unifies change. This also reframes death and accountability beyond this life. If personal identity depends on consciousness, then any ultimate judgment must address awareness. Punishment or reward disconnected from memory would lose meaning. Moral continuity presupposes remembered action. Even without theological extension, the existential demand remains severe. To live authentically is to maintain coherence between past and present self. To deny your history is to fracture identity. To refuse responsibility is to sever the thread. And yet, the thread must be woven intentionally. Education, environment, habit, all shape memory and reflection. The child begins without structured narrative. Through experience and guidance, consciousness develops complexity. Character emerges not as predetermined essence, but as constructed continuity, which returns us to the formative stage. If identity is built through experience and reflection, if the self is shaped by what it remembers and how it interprets, then the process by which young minds are formed becomes decisive. The architecture of consciousness is not accidental. It is cultivated, disciplined, directed. And once we recognize that the person is not fixed substance, but developing awareness, the question turns toward how that awareness should be trained so that freedom does not collapse into confusion and equality does not dissolve into disorder. Education is not decoration of the mind. It is construction of the self. If personal identity is continuity of consciousness, if the self is woven from memory, reflection, and deliberate awareness, then the shaping of that consciousness becomes the most decisive act in human life. John Locke does not treat education as secondary concern. He sees it as the workshop where freedom is either forged or crippled. The first claim is uncompromising. The child is not born virtuous or corrupt in fixed form. There are tendencies, impulses, capacities, but there is no sealed moral destiny. The mind begins as blank potential. What enters it, what habits are reinforced, what examples are witnessed, what disciplines are practiced, these become the architecture of character. Character is constructed before it is reasoned. Locke rejects the illusion that rational argument alone forms a person. Before abstract reasoning matures, habits take root. Repetition shapes inclination. Reward and correction carve pathways in consciousness. A child trained in self-control develops strength long before he can articulate principles of restraint. A child indulged in impulse learns weakness before he understands the word. Habit precedes philosophy. This is the second movement of his argument. Education must aim at virtue before knowledge, not because knowledge is unimportant, but because knowledge without discipline becomes dangerous. An undisciplined mind, armed with information, magnifies harm. A disciplined mind, even with limited knowledge, preserves integrity. Freedom requires inner structure. Now confront the modern condition. In 2025, information saturates childhood. Screens deliver endless content. Stimulation is constant. Attention fragments early. Education often emphasizes performance metrics over moral formation. Achievement replaces character. The result is a generation informed, yet unanchored. Locke would see this as inversion. He insists that education should cultivate independence of thought, not blind conformity, not mechanical memorization. The aim is to produce individuals capable of reasoning for themselves, capable of self-governance. If government is to remain limited and accountable, citizens must possess internal discipline. Without that, external freedom collapses into chaos. Political liberty depends on personal formation. The third movement sharpens the psychological insight. Shame and fear are weak foundations. Respect and example are stronger. Children imitate more than they obey. The conduct of parents and teachers imprints more deeply than lectures. Hypocrisy corrupts. Consistency strengthens. You cannot teach virtue while embodying vice. Education, therefore, is not transmission of data. It is modeling of character. The adult stands as living argument. Authority is persuasive when it aligns with conduct. Otherwise, it breeds cynicism. This principle extends beyond childhood. You continue to educate yourself through environment. The voices you allow to influence you, the habits you practice daily, the disciplines you accept or reject. These shape the continuity of your consciousness. Identity remains under construction as long as awareness persists. Do you choose your formation or drift through it? Locke's framework returns again to self-ownership. If you own yourself, you are responsible for your development. Others may guide, but you must consent internally to growth. Education imposed without engagement produces surface compliance, not transformation. True learning requires participation. There's also an ethical tension here. If the mind begins blank, and if experience shapes it profoundly, then inequality in upbringing translates into inequality in capacity. This does not negate equality of moral status, but it complicates social reality. A society that neglects education undermines its own stability. Ignorant citizens are vulnerable to manipulation. Undisciplined citizens erode trust. Formation is political destiny. Locke's educational vision aims at producing individuals who can manage freedom, self-control, critical thought, physical resilience, moral steadiness. These are not ornamental virtues. They are structural necessities for a society built on consent and limited power. Without them, the social contract weakens. Consider the internal analogy once more. Within your own life, when you neglect discipline, when you avoid reflection, when you chase immediate pleasure, your autonomy shrinks. You become ruled by impulse. You lose the capacity for long-term reasoning. Freedom dissolves into compulsion. The state of your character mirrors the state of your polity. Education, then, is not preparation for employment alone. It is preparation for freedom. To think independently without collapsing into arrogance. To disagree without hatred. To act decisively without tyranny. These capacities must be cultivated early. Locke does not advocate harsh severity. He warns against excessive punishment that breaks spirit rather than strengthens will. Discipline must be firm but rational. The goal is not submission, it is self-command. Self-command is the core of liberty. Now return to identity. If personal identity rests in continuity of consciousness, and if consciousness is shaped through memory and habit, then education determines the quality of that continuity. A mind trained to reflect deeply forms coherent narrative. A mind scattered by distraction forms fractured identity. Fragmented selves struggle to sustain moral responsibility. In a culture saturated with speed, the cultivation of patience becomes revolutionary. In a society obsessed with visibility, the cultivation of inward integrity becomes radical. Education must resist the currents that erode depth. But this responsibility extends beyond formal schooling. Society itself educates. Laws teach values. Institutions signal priorities. Public discourse models reasoning or rage. The collective environment becomes class rule. If leaders act without integrity, citizens learn cynicism. If public debate rewards extremism, youth internalize polarization. If success is measured solely by accumulation, character becomes secondary. Education is continuous social formation. Locke's vision binds all threads together. The blank slate of the mind, the limits of knowledge, the equality of persons, the origin of property and labor, the formation of government by consent, the necessity of limiting power, the right of resistance, the sanctity of conscience, the continuity of personal identity, all converge in formation. Because without individuals capable of reasoning, self-restraint, and moral reflection, none of the political architecture survives. Freedom degenerates, equality erodes, power expands unchecked. The final aim of education is independence, not isolation, but maturity. A person who can think, who can judge evidence proportionally, who can respect the rights of others while defending his own, who can resist tyranny without becoming tyrant. Such a person embodies the philosophical structure we have traced, and yet the task is never complete. Each generation begins again with blank potential. Each mind must rediscover limits, equality, responsibility. Each society must decide whether it will cultivate disciplined freedom or drift toward comfortable subjugation. The architecture stands, but whether it endures depends on the consciousness that inhabits it. Freedom is not a gift of history. It is a demand of human nature. John Locke did not merely revise philosophy. He redefined the human condition. He stripped away the illusion of innate certainty and forced us to confront the blank slate of the mind. He exposed the limits of knowledge and replaced arrogance with intellectual humility. He grounded equality not in sentiment, but in the original freedom of every person. He rooted property in labor, authority in consent, power in trust. He drew a line around government and dared it not to cross. He affirmed the right to resist when trust is broken. He defended conscience against coercion. He located identity not in substance, but in conscious continuity. And he saw education as the forge in which freedom must be formed. This is not a collection of political theories. It is a unified vision of what it means to be human. At the center stands a radical claim. The individual is prior to power, not chronologically, but morally. No ruler precedes the person. No institution outranks natural right. Authority is constructed, limited, conditional. It must answer to the very beings who created it. And beneath that political architecture lies a deeper existential structure. The mind begins empty. Knowledge grows through experience. Identity emerges through memory. Character forms through habit. Nothing is guaranteed. Nothing is fixed beyond change. Freedom is not inherited fully formed. It must be learned, disciplined, defended. This vision demands maturity. If we accept that knowledge is limited, we must reject fanaticism. If we accept that all are born equal, we must reject domination. If we accept that power is delegated, we must monitor it. If we accept that conscience cannot be forced, we must tolerate difference. If we accept that identity rests in awareness, we must cultivate reflection. If we accept that character is shaped, we must take education seriously. Locke places the burden where it belongs, on us. Modern societies often celebrate rights while neglecting the philosophical discipline that sustains them. We speak of freedom but avoid responsibility. We invoke equality but tolerate quiet hierarchies of influence. We demand protection but forget consent. We defend belief yet struggle with tolerance. We claim identity yet resist self-examination. Locke's thought cuts through this complacency. It reveals that liberal order is not self-sustaining. It rests on fragile foundations: rational restraint, moral accountability, disciplined formation. Remove these, and the structure cracks. His legacy is not loud revolution. It is something more demanding. It is the insistence that every human being is capable of growth through experience, that no authority stands above reason, that no power escapes limitation, that no conscience may be enslaved, that no identity is static, that no society remains free without educating its citizens to be independent thinkers. If the modern world believes in individual rights, constitutional government, religious tolerance, and the possibility of progress through rational reform, it does so because a philosopher once dared to question what everyone else assumed was given. Locke did not offer comfort. He offered responsibility. And in that responsibility lies both the burden and the dignity of being human.